The most dangerous front is no longer military, how the rivalry between America and China migrated from armies and markets into the struggle to define reality itself, or that no one declared. Great power rivalry was often straightforward throughout history. Conflict announced itself with mobilizations, speeches, sanctions, and eventually gunfire. Even the Cold War, despite its name, had recognizable rules, visible red lines and mutually understood dangers. When tensions rose, diplomats panicked, generals sharpened plans, and citizens sensed that something serious was unfolding. Today's rivalry between the United States and China feels different. There are warships in contested waters. To be sure. There are tariffs, export controls, block lists and technology embargoes. Yet these instruments, while dramatic, increasingly resemble symptoms rather than causes. They are expressions of a deeper contest whose center of gravity lies elsewhere. The most consequential front of the new great power struggle is not geographic. It does not run through Taiwan's air defense zone, the South China Sea or the Himalayan plateau. It runs through phones, screens, platforms, data centers and algorithms. It is not a war over territory, it is a war over interpretation. In this conflict, the decisive question is not who fires first, but who defines first, who explains events before others have time to disagree. Who frames crises before institutions react, and who supplies meaning in moments of confusion. Power, once measured in firepower, is increasingly exercised through feeling. From hard power to cognitive power, classical geopolitics rested on physical constraint. Armies blocked movement. Navies controlled sea lanes. Nuclear weapons imposed ultimate deterrence. Even economic statecraft, sanctions, blockades, trade wars, run by denying material resources. Information power works differently. It does not compel behavior directly. Instead, it shapes the environment in which decisions are made. It influences what populations fear, what leaders believe they can justify, and what outcomes appear inevitable. In such a system, action follows narrative rather than the reverse. This is not entirely new. Propaganda has existed as long as politics itself. What is new is scale, speed and automation. Digital systems allow narratives to travel globally in seconds, targeted precisely at receptive audiences, reinforced continuously by algorithms optimized not for truth but for engagement. The result is a transformation in how influence runs. Political outcomes no longer depend solely on persuasion or coercion. They depend on attention, what people notice, what they ignore, and what they accept as common sense. In this sense, information has become the precondition of power, why the old metrics no longer suffice. Western policymakers still instinctively count tanks, aircraft carriers and GDP growth rates. These are still relevant, but they increasingly do not explain outcomes. Why do smaller states sometimes defy stronger ones with clear confidence? Why do sanctions produce unpredictable political effects? Why do crises escalate online faster than diplomats can hold them? The answer often lies not in material capability but in narrative advantage. If a government can convince its public that an external threat is existential, domestic costs become tolerable. If it can portray economic pain as patriotic sacrifice, opposition weakens. If it can frame instability as foreign sabotage, accountability dissolves. Conversely, even powerful states struggle to act when public opinion fragments, legitimacy erodes, or information environments become chaotic. This asymmetry explains much of the current American anxiety. The United States stays militarily unmatched, yet politically constrained. It can project force abroad but finds it increasingly difficult to sustain consensus at home or credibility abroad. China, by contrast, wields less traditional military reach but runs within a far more disciplined narrative system. The rivalry is thus not simply between two states, but between two models of managing reality. America's structural handicap. America's greatest strategic advantage in the 20th century was openness. Free media, pluralistic debate and decentralized institutions generated innovation, legitimacy and global appeal. The liberal order sold itself precisely because it did not appear choreographed. In the 21st century, those same traits have become liabilities. The American information ecosystem is vast, fragmented and commercially driven. Social media companies are neither state organs nor neutral utilities, they are attention merchants whose incentives reward emotional intensity over accuracy. Falsehood spreads not because citizens are ignorant, but because outrage travels faster than correction. Algorithms do not distinguish between truth and fabrication, only between content that keeps users engaged and content that does not. This leaves Washington with limited leverage. The government cannot easily direct narratives without violating constitutional norms. It cannot silence misinformation without accusations of censorship. It cannot coordinate messaging without appearing propagandistic. Every attempt to assert control risks undermining the very values it looks to defend. Thus, America fights the information war with one hand tied, not because it lacks tools, but because its political culture rejects their use. China's alternative model: China works under no such constraints. Its media system, digital platforms and data flows are integrated into a broader governance architecture. Information management is not an ad hoc response to crises but a permanent function of the state. This does not mean Chinese narratives are universally persuasive. Often, they are not. But persuasion is not always the goal. China's strategy prioritizes consistency over charisma, endurance over virality. Messages are repeated patiently across years, not tailored to dominate a single news cycle. Where America looks to convince, China often looks to condition, to familiarize global audiences with certain assumptions: that stability outweighs liberty, that Western democracy is chaotic, that multipolarity is inevitable, and that China's rise is natural rather than threatening. The goal is not admiration, but acceptance. In influence warfare, acceptance is often sufficient, influence without conversion. One of the West's persistent analytical errors is assuming that influence must resemble persuasion. It imagines propaganda as crude messaging designed to change minds directly. Modern influence operations work differently. They do not need belief, only doubt. They do not need audiences to support China, only to question America. They do not aim to replace narratives entirely, merely to erode confidence in existing ones. If citizens believe all information is biased, then truth loses its authority. If every claim seems partisan, then power flows to whoever acts decisively rather than convincingly. In this environment, authoritarian systems enjoy a structural advantage. They can present unity, certainty and continuity. Democracies, by contrast, display disagreement publicly, which can appear as weakness when stripped of context. The irony is that transparency, once democracy's greatest strength, becomes a vulnerability when weaponized by adversaries. Platforms as strategic terrain. In earlier centuries, control of trade routes determined power. In the digital age, control of platforms performs a similar function. Social networks, video sharing apps, messaging services and AI-driven search tools are no longer mere businesses. They are infrastructures of belief. Their algorithms decide which issues trend, which scandals persist and which conflicts fade quietly from view. They shape emotional tempo, how long outrage lasts, how quickly empathy dissipates, how rapidly narratives cycle. Governments understand this increasingly well. Hence the intensifying battles over platform ownership, data localization and content governance. Debates about TikTok, for example, are rarely about dance videos. They are about who controls the recommendation engine that mediates political consciousness for hundreds of millions of users. The fight is not over speech, but over amplification. Data, the new strategic resource. If oil powered the 20th century, data powered the 21st century. Data does not merely fuel economic growth, it enables behavioral prediction, narrative targeting and policy modeling. Whoever controls large-scale data flows gains insight into societal moods before those societies themselves recognize them. This explains why disputes over cloud infrastructure, undersea cables and digital payment systems have bought geopolitical intensity. They are not technical matters. They decide who can see patterns, expect unrest and influence outcomes preemptively. In this sense, information warfare is anticipatory rather than reactive. It aims to shape future choices by structuring present awareness, artificial intelligence, and the acceleration of influence. The rise of generative artificial intelligence intensifies these dynamics dramatically. AI systems can produce content at scale, tailor messages to individual psychological profiles, and adapt narratives in real time based on audience reaction. Influence becomes automated. The danger is not that AI will fabricate convincing lies, humans have long done that, but that it will flood the information environment so thoroughly that verification becomes impossible at speed. When everything is potentially synthetic, skepticism becomes default. And when skepticism becomes universal, authority collapses. In such conditions, decisive actors gain advantage over deliberative ones. This again favors centralized systems over pluralistic ones. The illusion of disconnected crises, viewed individually, recent geopolitical disputes appear fragmented, trade wars here, technology bans there, disputes over AI ethics, arguments about digital currencies, clashes over satellite networks. Seen collectively, they reveal a single organizing logic. Each reflects anxiety over narrative sovereignty, over who controls interpretation within national borders and beyond them. States no longer worry only about invasion, they worry about infiltration. Influence. They no longer fear bombs alone, they fear erosion belief. Thus, policies that seem protective, paranoid or incoherent often stem from a consistent fear, losing the ability to explain the world to one's own population. A government that cannot explain events cannot govern them. 11. The Global South as the decisive arena. While Western commentary often frames the U.S.-China rivalry as bilateral, its decisive arena lies elsewhere. Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia and the Middle East are not merely spectators. They are narrative battlegrounds. These regions are less invested in ideological purity and more concerned with development, stability, and autonomy. They judge great powers less by rhetoric and more by reliability. China's messaging here emphasizes infrastructure, non-interference, and respect for sovereignty. America's messaging emphasizes values, transparency, and democratic norms. Neither is universally persuasive. But China benefits from a crucial asymmetry. It rarely asks others to reform themselves. In an information war, moral demands can be liabilities. America's narrative fatigue. Part of America's difficulty stems from exhaustion. After decades of intervention, financial crises and polarization, American moral authority feels overextended. Its claims sound familiar, its inconsistencies are well documented. Whenever Washington refers to a rules-based order, people often remember the instances where exceptions were made. When it speaks of democracy, others note domestic turmoil. This does not make American arguments false, but it weakens their resonance. Influence depends not only on truth, but on trust accumulated over time. Trust, once lost, is difficult to regenerate through messaging alone. China's limits, yet China's approach is not without constraints. Its narratives lack emotional appeal in liberal societies. Its controlled media environment struggles to generate spontaneity. Its emphasis on stability can appear stifling rather than reassuring. Moreover, influence cannot be entirely manufactured. Authenticity matters. Even in an age of algorithms, China may succeed in dulling criticism, but converting admiration stays difficult. Still, admiration is not needed for strategic success, in a world where indecision paralyses rivals. Even partial influence can be decisive. A war without escalation ladders. Traditional military conflict runs on escalation ladders. Each step carries known risks. Information warfare lacks such structure. There is no clear threshold between competition and aggression, no universally accepted definition of interference, no treaty governing acceptable behavior. This ambiguity suits actors willing to run persistently below the level of confrontation. It also makes deterrence nearly impossible. How does one retaliate against a narrative? How does one sanction an algorithm? The absence of rules creates perpetual instability. The psychological cost. The greatest casualty of this conflict may not be geopolitical balance, but civic confidence. As societies drown in competing claims, citizens retreat into tribes. Shared reality fragments. Institutions lose authority not because they fail, but because belief in them erodes. When people no longer agree on basic facts, compromise becomes betrayal and governance becomes theater. This internal weakening may matter more than any external threat. Empires rarely fall because they are conquered. They fall because they can no longer explain themselves convincingly to their own people. The paradox of transparency: Western societies pride themselves on transparency. Yet transparency without trust can be destabilizing, when every internal debate is broadcast globally. Rivals gain insight into vulnerabilities. When disagreements are amplified without context, pluralism appears as chaos. Authoritarian systems conceal conflict, democracies display it. The challenge for democracies is not to imitate secrecy, but to rebuild confidence in disagreement as strength rather than failure. That, however, is far harder than regulating a platform. Toward narrative resilience, if information warfare cannot be won, it can at least be endured. The aim should not be dominance, but resilience, the ability of societies to absorb misinformation without fracturing, to debate fiercely without delegitimizing institutions, and to correct errors without descending into cynicism. This requires education, media literacy, institutional credibility, and leadership capable of explaining complexity honestly. It requires, above all, patience, an unfashionable virtue in algorithmic politics, the quiet redefinition of power. In the emerging international system, power is increasingly measured not by coercive capacity but by narrative endurance. Which states can sustain coherent stories about themselves, which can adapt without losing identity, which can persuade citizens that institutions still matter? These questions will shape global order more profoundly than troop deployments. The battlefield has shifted inward, a contest without final victors. There will be no surrender ceremonies in information warfare. No peace treaty can restore a shared global narrative. The struggle to define reality will persist as long as technology mediates belief. The aim, therefore, is not victory but stability, and stability, in this domain, depends less on silencing others than on strengthening oneself. The most dangerous front between the United States and China is not military, because military conflict is still bounded by fear of escalation. Information conflict has no such restraint. It runs continuously, invisibly, and cumulatively. It reshapes societies slowly, almost imperceptibly, until outcomes seem natural rather than imposed. By the time its effects are visible, the decisions have already been made, by publics, markets, and institutions reacting to a reality that has been quietly curated for them. In the 20th century, wars destroyed cities. In the 21st century, they may quietly dissolve certainty. And in a world unsure of what is true, power belongs not to those who are strongest, but to those who decide what seems real.